It is just past midnight on the Iranian coastline. Somewhere above the Strait of Hormuz, a B-2 Spirit bomber that Iran's entire air defense network cannot see opens its bomb bay doors and releases something the size of a small school bus. It falls at nearly the speed of sound, punches through more than 60 feet of reinforced mountain rock, and detonates so deep underground that the surface barely flinches. No fireball, no mushroom cloud, just a tremor, a puff of dust rising from a crack in the hillside, and then silence. But underneath that patch of desert, a facility that took Iran years and billions of dollars to construct simply stops existing. Gone in a fraction of a second, with almost nothing visible above ground to show for it, and here is what nobody is telling you about that moment. That bomb did not just destroy a building, it destroyed a belief, a strategic doctrine that half the world's most dangerous regimes have staked their survival on for the past 3 decades. The idea that if you bury something deep enough, no one can touch it. That idea died in the mountains outside Qom, and the people who should be paying the closest attention to what that means are not in Tehran. They are in Beijing, Pyongyang, and Moscow. Before I walk you through exactly how these weapons work, why the coverage you have seen is missing the most important part of this story, and what it means for every country on Earth that has been digging underground for the past 20 years, do me a quick favor, hit that like button right now. It costs you nothing, takes less than 2 seconds, and it tells the algorithm that serious analysis like this deserves a real audience. If you are new here, subscribe and tap that notification bell. This is not a channel that simplifies things to make them comfortable. This is where we look at what is actually happening, and what is actually happening right now is far bigger than the headlines suggest. The story most people have been told about America's bunker buster campaign against Iran goes something like this. The United States has very big bombs. Iran built very deep bunkers. America dropped the big bombs on the deep bunkers. Some of them hit. The coverage shows satellite imagery before and after. Analysts point at craters. Commentators debate whether Fordow was fully destroyed or merely damaged. And then everyone moves on to the next headline. That version of the story is not wrong, but it is incomplete in a way that fundamentally distorts what actually happened and why it matters. Because what the coverage treats as a straightforward military event, big bomb hits buried target, is actually the culmination of a 35-year engineering arms race that most people have never heard of. And the outcome of that arms race just became visible for the first time in a live combat environment. To understand the significance, you need to understand the problem these weapons were originally built to solve. Because the problem was never about Iran specifically. It was about a shift in how adversaries hide. Starting in the early 1990s, after the Gulf War demonstrated that the United States could destroy virtually anything it could see from the air, a handful of countries arrived at the same conclusion almost simultaneously. If you cannot defend your most critical infrastructure from American air power, you bury it. You dig tunnels into mountainsides. You pour hundreds of meters of reinforced concrete over enrichment halls and missile storage facilities and command bunkers. You move the things you cannot afford to lose so far underground that no bomb in any arsenal on Earth can reach them. Iran did this with its nuclear program. Fordow, built directly into a mountain near the city of Qom, was the most visible example, but it was far from the only one. Command bunkers, missile production facilities, ammunition depots, and Revolutionary Guard headquarters were all constructed with one shared design philosophy: depth equals safety. North Korea adopted the same logic on an even more ambitious scale, boring thousands of tunnels into granite mountains across the Korean peninsula. China invested billions in underground facilities for its nuclear forces and its most sensitive command infrastructure. Russia hardened its strategic command network deep beneath the Ural Mountains decades ago and has continued expanding ever since. All of these programs rested on the same foundational assumption: there is a depth below which American weapons simply cannot reach. That assumption held for decades. It does not hold anymore. And the implications of that shift extend so far beyond Iran that the Iran-specific coverage is almost a distraction from the real story. I need you to stay with me through this because this is where it gets genuinely important. The American arsenal of penetrating weapons is not one bomb. It is a layered system, and each layer was designed to answer a specific version of the underground problem. Understanding the hierarchy is the key to understanding why these strikes against Iran represent something categorically different from anything that came before. Think of it as 3 tiers, each one built to go deeper than the last, each one revealing something different about how the United States military has been thinking about this problem for the past 3 decades. The first tier is the GBU-57, a 2,000-pound bomb fitted with a JDAM guidance kit and a hardened penetrating warhead. This is the workhorse. It cannot reach the deepest targets, but it can punch through standard reinforced concrete, hardened storage facilities, and shallow bunkers with GPS-guided precision. It is carried by almost every strike aircraft in the American inventory, from F-15E Strike Eagles to F-18 Super Hornets to B-1B Lancers. In the campaign against Iran, this weapon has reportedly been used extensively against ammunition depots, coastal missile storage sites, and hardened command facilities that were built to survive conventional bombing but were never designed to survive a dedicated penetrator arriving at exactly the right angle. The footage that circulated from a strike near Isfahan, a massive primary explosion followed by a chain of secondary blasts as stored munitions cooked off underground, that was almost certainly a GBU-31 or a weapon in its class doing exactly what it was designed to do. That was Tier 1. The second tier is the GBU-72, sometimes called the Advanced 5,000-Pound Penetrator. This weapon was purpose-built as the replacement for the Gulf War-era GBU-28, which was itself an improvised solution cobbled together in weeks from surplus artillery gun barrels packed with explosives when commanders realized they had no way to reach Iraqi command bunkers. The GBU-72 is not improvised. It is a dedicated, deep penetration weapon designed from the ground up to survive impact with solid rock at terminal velocity without breaking apart, then continue driving downward through dozens of feet of material before a specialized fuse counts layers of density, distinguishing between rock, concrete, void spaces, and structural chambers, and triggers detonation at the precise depth where the blast will do maximum damage to the target rather than wasting itself on an empty corridor. U.S. Central Command confirmed that GBU-72s were used against hardened Iranian anti-ship missile facilities along the Strait of Hormuz. These were not random coastal targets. They were the fortified positions Iran had spent years constructing specifically to survive conventional air attack, the positions that gave Iran its ability to threaten commercial shipping through a waterway that carries roughly 1/5 of the world's daily oil supply. The fact that they were destroyed by a weapon an F-15E Strike Eagle can carry under its wing tells you something profound about how completely the balance between offense and defense has shifted. Iran spent years and enormous resources hardening those sites. The United States eliminated them with a weapon that does not even require a stealth bomber to deliver. That was Tier 2. The third tier is the one that rewrites everything. The GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator. 30,000 pounds, 20 feet long, roughly the weight of a loaded school bus. Only one aircraft on Earth is currently configured to carry it in combat, the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber, because no other platform combines the payload capacity and the radar and visibility required to deliver something this large into defended airspace undetected. The Massive Ordnance Penetrator was not designed for ammunition depots or coastal missile sites. It was designed for one category of target and one category only: deeply buried, mountain-hardened nuclear facilities, targets like Fordow. When the GBU-57 struck Fordow, it settled a debate that had consumed military planners, intelligence analysts, and policymakers for over a decade. Whether any weapon in any arsenal could actually reach what Iran had buried under that mountain? The answer arrived in the form of a tremor and a dust cloud in a facility that simply ceased to function. That was Tier 3. 3 tiers of penetrating weapons, 3 different categories of buried target, one unmistakable conclusion. The underground era, the strategic doctrine that said depth equals safety, has been systematically dismantled from the shallowest bunker to the deepest mountain in a single campaign. And the silence around what that actually means is the loudest signal in this entire conflict. Here is where the coverage fails and where the real story starts. Almost every outlet covering these strikes has treated them as individual tactical events. A bomb hit a target. Damage was assessed. The map was updated. That approach tells you what happened on the surface. It tells you nothing about what has been communicated to every military planner on the planet, because the bunker buster campaign against Iran was not just a series of strikes against Iranian facilities. It was a live, public, fully documented demonstration that the strategy of going underground, the strategy that China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran all independently adopted as their primary answer to American air superiority, no longer works. Every country that has spent the last 2 decades pouring concrete and boring tunnels just watched their investment get invalidated in real time, broadcast on satellite imagery for the entire world to study. That is not a tactical event. That is a strategic earthquake. And nobody in official channels on either side has an incentive to frame it that way. The United States military does not want to publicly declare that it can reach any buried target anywhere on Earth, because maintaining some ambiguity about the limits of these weapons is itself a strategic asset. Iran does not want to acknowledge that its deepest facilities were destroyed because that admission would shatter the domestic narrative of resilience and resistance that the regime depends on. And the countries watching from the sidelines, China, North Korea, Russia, certainly do not want a public conversation about whether their own underground programs are now obsolete. So the coverage stays at the tactical level, bomb hit target, damage assessed, map updated, and the strategic revolution hiding underneath goes unexamined. If this analysis is landing for you in a way the mainstream coverage has not, take 10 seconds. Subscribe if you have not already. Tap the notification bell and share this video with one person who needs to understand what these strikes actually mean beyond the headlines. This kind of analysis does not spread by accident. It spreads because viewers like you decide it should. Now let me talk about the part of this story that never makes it into the engineering analysis, but that matters just as much. Because all of this technical precision, the guidance kits, the density counting fuses, the hardened casings designed to survive impact at hundreds of miles per hour, exists within a real conflict that produces real consequences for real people whose lives intersect with this war, whether they chose to be part of it or not. Think of a man we will call Nikos. We do not know his real name. He is a composite, a stand-in for what multiple tanker captains and shipping industry sources have described publicly since this conflict began. Nikos has spent almost 30 years moving crude oil and cargo through some of the most contested waters on the planet. For most of his career, a transit through the Strait of Hormuz was a few hours of heightened attention. Crowded radar screens, constant radio chatter, occasionally a naval escort keeping watch a few miles off his stern. On a typical pre-war day, well over 100 ships might pass through that stretch of water without incident. That is not the strait Nikos navigates now. Reports describe roughly 20 commercial vessels attacked in and around the strait since this conflict began. Some hit by missiles, others by drones. At least one incident severe enough that the crew had to abandon ship entirely. Before each transit, Nikos checks with his company about which sections of the Iranian coastline have had missile sites confirmed destroyed and which ones remain unclear. He makes a judgment call that used to be about weather and traffic and is now about whether his ship might become a target. The conversations he has with his crew are about hazard pay, about whether their insurance covers what they are sailing into, about calling home before losing signal in waters where help might be hours away if something goes wrong. The bunker buster strikes on Iran's coastal missile positions were not abstract demonstrations of engineering capability for someone like Nikos. They were the difference between a waterway that might kill him and one that might not. Oil prices jumped more than 40% after the escalation, pushing above $100 a barrel. Domestic gas prices in the United States crossed $4 a gallon. The ripple from a bomb detonating inside a mountain in Iran reaches all the way to a fuel pump in Ohio. That is the chain reaction nobody talks about when they focus only on penetration depth and warhead yield. I also want to be direct about something because it matters more than the engineering. Alongside the confirmed military strikes, human rights organizations tracking this conflict from inside Iran have reported significant civilian casualties, with some estimates reaching into the thousands, including children. These figures have not been independently verified by neutral international bodies in the same way that Central Command strike confirmations have, and estimates from different organizations vary. But telling this story only through the lens of precision weapons and strategic calculation, without acknowledging that real people in real cities have died and been displaced, would be dishonest. The entire design philosophy behind penetrating weapons, concentrating destructive force deep underground rather than spreading it across the surface, exists specifically to limit civilian harm. That is a meaningful distinction from older, cruder munitions. But it does not make the human cost disappear, and pretending otherwise would insult both the people affected and your intelligence as a viewer. Now here is where I need you to zoom out with me because this is the frame that changes everything. What happened at Fordow, what happened at the coastal missile sites along the strait, what happened at the ammunition depots near Isfahan, these were not isolated military operations. They were proof of concept. Every mountain fortress, every hardened nuclear facility, every buried command bunker that any country on Earth has ever constructed was built on the assumption that depth equals safety. That assumption has now been publicly, visibly, undeniably falsified. China has invested billions in underground facilities for its nuclear deterrent and its most sensitive military infrastructure. Those planners are studying the satellite imagery from Fordow right now and asking themselves a question they have never had to ask before. Is what we built deep enough? North Korea's entire military posture is built around a tunnel network so extensive that it has been described as one of the most fortified countries on Earth. Those tunnels were designed to survive exactly the kind of air campaign the United States just executed against Iran. The engineers who designed them are now recalculating whether their assumptions about American penetration capability still hold, and they are recalculating with substantially less confidence than they had 6 months ago. Russia's Strategic Command infrastructure, buried deep beneath mountains in the Urals, was designed during the Cold War to survive a nuclear first strike. The question of whether conventional penetrating weapons could reach it was always considered secondary because no conventional weapon could. That question is no longer secondary. The trajectory these weapons are on, from improvised artillery barrels in 1991 to purpose-built 30,000-pound penetrators today, suggests that the next generation will go deeper still, and the generation after that deeper again. The arms race between those who dig and those who build weapons to reach what has been buried is not over. But for the first time in 35 years, the side doing the digging just lost its lead, and every government on Earth that staked its survival on concrete and depth is now operating in a world where that bet no longer pays the way it used to. That is the story the daily coverage is not telling you. Not a bomb hitting a building, not a crater on a satellite image, a strategic doctrine that half the world's most dangerous regimes organize their survival around, dying in real time under the mountains of Iran, while the coverage debates penetration depth and the diplomats argue about ceasefire terms. The Bunker Buster campaign was never about Iran alone. Iran was the proof. The message was for everyone watching, and everyone is watching. If this analysis helped you see something the headlines missed, subscribe, hit the bell, and drop a comment with your assessment of where this goes next. Share this with one person who deserves to understand what just changed. The story is still being written, and what happens next depends on who understood the message that was just sent from 60 feet underground.